Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now. Why don't doctors speak out? That is a common question I get from patients, people on social media. And this is not just related to the pandemic. It's just about things that they know are true, that the science knows is true. I mean, just take vitamin C. Patients will ask, why don't doctors speak out about vitamin C? Well, here's a couple quotes from a person that we have on as a guest today, and you know him. He needs no introduction, but I will attempt to provide that. Two quotes from him. Early on, he did speak out, and he spoke out boldly. Quote, Ivermectin is effectively a miracle drug against COVID-19, and it's a gift to humanity. This podcast series, it is going to tell you the story of doctors who early on and during the pandemic, but maybe in other areas of medicine and culture, they have spoken out. They have spoken out boldly and loudly, and as a result, they were censored. So what we're going to do here is we're going to acknowledge and we're going to celebrate their story, and we're going to allow them to give you some insight to what it means to be censored in medicine today and what that looked like in reality and what they did to manage it. Because I think many people out there know those who have been censored, but they don't quite understand it. But this series, it's going to help you to understand it. So first, before I introduce them, let's talk about that word censorship. You know me, I like words. Censorship, it is two words together, censor and ship. Really quick history timeline here. In 16th century Rome, censor was a census or purview of public manners and morals. So a positive annotation there. In Latin, it became censor was a speak solemnly or proclaim. So again, still a positive tilt to that. But in the 16th century English, it started to change a little bit. Official judgment of morals and conduct. And in the 17th century, empowered officials to determine if anything is immoral or heretical in books, films, plays, culture. And then finally, in the 19th century, state agents were charged with suppression of speech or narrative deemed counter to the approved political narrative. See, that was the 19th century, but this became full on display with the Third Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. Now, people would look at history and they go, oh, that's history. We would never deal with that today. But we just did, and we still do. And then the final word there, ship, it's the power, the office of power or position. So it's the ability to invoke a power through a position. And that's what we saw the last several years. So I want to go ahead and introduce my guest here today. You know him well. He really needs no introduction, but he's a physician. And I think this is important. He's a pulmonary and critical care specialist. A lot of people lose sight of that because of the advocacy that he's really taken on. And he's really a speaker of truth, but he's a physician. He's a scientist. He's an international speaker. I'd say he's a COVID expert, and he's an author. You got to check out this book. I've read it once, pick through it all the time. You'll find it on Amazon, I believe. It's called The War on Ivermectin, the medicine that saved millions and could have ended the pandemic. He's got numerous publications in the research literature on critical care ultrasound, sepsis treatment. And I follow him, and you need to, on his Substack, Pierre Kory's Medical Musings. But he's become a patient and a doctor advocate. He's testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs at least twice, and I'm sure many other legislative bodies. Dr. Pierre Kory, welcome to the Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast.
Nathan, it's good to see you, and really good to be here, man. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, I do too. You know, and your story here, I think, is it's truly emblematic, and it truly represents and encompasses a lot of what people have experienced. And you've never shied away from it. And I want to kind of dive into that because your boldness, I think it's lost on many, but it's something that I admire. And I think more doctors could follow suit with that. But there's nothing that connects like a story, identifies like a story, or speaks truth like a story. So if we could start off, what I'd love to do is just tell your story, how this process developed. Because I don't think you went into 2019 going, this is the year that I'm going to speak boldly and change what I do.
Yep.
It probably just happened, right? I mean, what happened there?
You know what, Nathan? I was going to say something like, before this happened, like, yeah, you're right. I was not a public figure. I didn't have a public voice, but either personality wise or culture wise, meaning I'm from New York, I always spoke pretty like plainly, like cut through the, I'm a guy who calls out elephants in the room, like, especially when I was like a chief of critical care at the University of Wisconsin, which is Midwest, Midwest nice and all that stuff. And I'd be in these meetings and I would just think like some of the policies, what they were proposing were absurd. And I would just call it out right in the meeting. And people were shocked at my kind of boldness. And I remember like after meetings, some of the colleagues that really liked me, I think a lot of were either intimidated or annoyed by me. But the ones that liked me, they'd be like, oh, man, I can't believe you said that. That's really cool. So I was a guy who, always called stuff out that I saw needed to be called out. But the other thing I wanted to start with, Nathan, is, you talked about censorship, right? And a little bit of the definition, but, we have to always bring up propaganda because it's it's the right hand and the left hand. They both work together. They don't just do one, right? They always do one paired with the other. And so the censorship is the overt censoring actions, but they also use propaganda to censor you, meaning most of the propaganda directed at me was to destroy my credibility, which is a censoring action, right? So as soon as they can present an image of me as uncredible, then people don't listen, right? Which is another way of censorship. And so the propaganda was immense as well. But listen, Nathan, it's funny. Many people will say to me, Dr. Kory, when I'm speaking or go somewhere, they'll say, oh, Dr. Kory, you're a hero. Your courage was really inspiring. And it wasn't courage at the beginning, Nathan. It was just naive. I didn't know when I gave my first testimony in May of 2020 on the critical need for corticosteroids, right? I did that at a time when every national and international health organization was saying not to use it in COVID. And I was calling it out that it absolutely needed to be used in the hospital phase of the disease. And, I didn't get a lot of attacks for that. I got attacks from my own university. So University of Wisconsin, my boss, and I know he was calling on part of the dean, they wanted me to STFU. They were like literally calling me. And I had already taken a leave to go to New York to fight that first wave in my old ICU in New York. So I'm like working 12, 14-hour days. And my boss is calling me, telling me I needed to ask for permission before talking to the press. And I was like, I was like really irritated at that. And I refused to do that. And I even hired a lawyer because I thought they were harassing me so much. I hired a lawyer and the lawyer wrote this beautiful letter. Just a really powerful letter talking about the responsibility of a professor. An academic, in an academic position, we're actually responsible to share our expertise with the public. Where I was at an institution of higher learning and the First Amendment at the University of Wisconsin. Actually, the University of Wisconsin is well known to support the First Amendment for all their professors, with one exception, which I learned because one of the press people at the University of Wisconsin kind of secretly told me this. They said that the chancellor and the university prizes and supports all their professors to speak freely and openly, except for the dean of the medical school. The dean of the medical school at the University of Wisconsin was really ripping that I had testified without letting them know in the Homeland Security meeting, that I'd given some interviews. And so that was kind of interesting. But really, everything came to a head with ivermectin. When I gave that testimony in December of 2020, and that thing went viral, and suddenly ivermectin was like on the words of everybody, not only in this country, but it went around the world. I was getting calls from physician groups to give them lectures and all this stuff from many countries in Europe, even South Africa. I gave a lot of lectures to. And so suddenly I was someone who's getting attention, and I was happily, responding with it. But Nathan, when I gave that testimony, I thought I didn't think I was going to get a ticker tape parade, but I thought I was putting out information that was life-saving, critical to know that everyone would somewhat, I guess, embrace. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. I started getting attacked. And that's quote that you read of mine, about how I called it a miracle drug.
Yeah. That
was the first censoring action after me. So I'll start the story there, right? So I give my ivermectin testimony. What was interesting is while I was still in the hearing room, so I just finished testifying, there were other experts testifying, and I was getting texts from my colleagues, and one of them was like, Fox News wants to interview you. And I literally just finished 10 minutes ago, and I guess they were watching and they thought it was compelling. And so I did a Fox News interview right after that hearing. But the next thing that happened was a day later, the Associated Press called. And I did an interview with this young reporter, gave her all of this information. She was a little skeptical, but it was a reasonable conversation. And I was just burying her with all the data that I had compiled from just all around the world, these trials, as well as health ministry reports that were using it in early treatment. Buried her with all this data. And you know what came out the very next day? The article said, ivermectin is not a miracle drug. Whoa. And then the article basically just went after me. And they used, pulled in a couple of other experts, who basically said the same thing they always do, is that the evidence is low quality, weak, small, all these. They just attack that inconvenient science. And
it was a hit job.
It was so bad, Nathan. We filed an ethics complaint against the Associated Press. And what's interesting about that is the leadership of the Associated Press, like the president, the CEO, and the head of ethics, they made a mistake. They did a reply all to us. So we got to see a little bit of their conversation. It wasn't much, but the president or the CEO was basically telling his colleagues, delay them. We need to buy some more time. Just keep them at bay. And so I guess they were bothered by our ethics complaint. And then obviously 4 days later, they found no ethical violations on part of the journalist.
You had another quote. Ivermectin is a dirty word in the media, kind of alluding to that. It doesn't work. It's a deadly horse dewormer. Prescribe or promote it and you'll be called a right-wing quack. Be banned from social media or lose your license to practice medicine. That's what struck me is, early on, I've been running integrative cancer clinics for a while, but early on during the pandemic, I was numb, Pierre. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I watched your testimony in real time. I think I remember the Fox News, but those were times where it was like, I just couldn't put my head around it. But then it really started to make sense on the Saturday night, supposed to be comedic night shows. And they basically labeled ivermectin a horse dewormer. And actually the CDC had it on their website at a social media post, I think, on Facebook for a short time. And they took it down. But it's like, yes, it was a horse dewormer, but just this thought that you're forgetting, this fact, it's FDA approved. Yep. And we use it off label like so many drugs. And so at that point, I knew it took me a little time. You clearly had been prepped through your life and career to lead this process of truth telling, I think. But it was at that moment that I knew we were up against pure propaganda, as you mentioned.
And Brett Weinstein, he talks about, he describes like what we're up against. Like, you can't see it, you can't feel it, but you get a sense it's something big out there that's pushing back against you. And, it came at me in so many different ways. And like that Associated Press was the first kind of wake up, where I was like, wow, this is weird. Like they have done, and I actually thought that first article was almost a crime against humanity, because here they are trying to neutralize the science that was coming out. And And, you've read my book, right? And it's thematically structured around an article that I read called the Disinformation Playbook. And in that article, they outline the 5 tactics that industries deploy when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. And the day that I read that article, which was March of 21, my head exploded because I was like, oh my gosh, this is what's going on, because I couldn't understand everything that was happening to me. So the Associated Press article, then there were also some, then the New York Times went off hard on Ron Johnson. They called him the snake oil salesman of the Senate, right? Because he was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and he's the one who had invited me. And the article that they wrote just skewered him for bringing in these, wacko, uncredible scientists and researchers and doctors like me, McCullough, Risch. I mean, guys who were like at the heads of their field for decades, and they just trashed us in the New York Times. And so I sobered up pretty quick from my optimism. And then the very next action was my paper. So I'd written right before that testimony, I had finished my review paper called Review of the Emerging Evidence Around Ivermectin. It's just all of the data that we had. It was just overwhelming. And that had gone through 3 rounds of peer review with senior scientists, actually from the NIH and the FDA. I mean, they were scientists that were known by the editor. It wasn't like, they were doing that in their employment. But it went through peer review and was accepted for publication. And it was an online journal. It was Frontiers in Pharmacology, very prominent journal, Frontiers. And day after day went by. And this is January of 21, which was the peak of the deaths from all of COVID. And day after day would go by, and I wasn't getting proofs. They weren't publishing it. They just left the abstract up. And finally, I just knew something was bad going on. I wrote to the journal. I said, I suspect scientific misconduct, and unless this isn't addressed, I'm going to go public. And within a day, they called my editor. My editor of that special issue was actually Robert Malone. And they told Robert that they were retracting the paper, that they'd gotten some anonymous third-party reviewer, never got to see their review. And that anonymous third-party reviewer found that my conclusions were not supported by my data. Now, that would be news to the other peer reviewers, who really strongly reviewed my paper. But anyway, so then it was the retraction, right? So first it's the hits in the media, then it was that retraction. That one, the day that it got retracted was a really bad day for me in terms of emotion. I'll tell you why. I think what would happen is Robert was talking with this chief editor, and he was saying like, well, why can't we revise it or review it, see the review? Because normally when you peer review, if there's an objection to something you're saying or how you're interpreting data, the peer reviewer will tell you, no, you can't do that. This is too strong of a state, and they'll make you revise it. And I asked for a revision, and the answer was that this journal no longer wanted to work with me because of my behavior, because of that email. And Nathan, because of that, I felt personally responsible that I had failed to get this thing published, to get it out to the world and to get it out into science. And I felt terrible. I really felt like had I not written that email, they might have given me a chance to review it. I will say, though, Nathan, 3 days, I think I felt crappy for 3 days. But then I came to the very solid realization that paper was never getting published, period. End of story. It had nothing to do with my email. That was just an excuse for them to just make me go away. And so, but that retraction was big. And, I lost 3 jobs in the pandemic. The first one, University of Wisconsin, I resigned over a moral and ethical objection to what they were doing. I said, I cannot serve as a clinical chief and leader if this is what the institution is going to do. Because what the institution was doing is I was the head of 17 intensivists, and I was trying to encourage them to use anticoagulation, corticosteroids, all these things that the patients were dying. They were not improving. They were all like landing on ventilators and then slowly deteriorating to death. And you could see they were dying from lack of treatment. But I was getting blocked. Like my superiors did not like that I was proposing treatments that were not supported by the evidence, with randomized controlled trials. And And they were just doing supportive care only, fluids, Tylenol, oxygen, ventilators, food. And it was just absurd. And I said, it was funny. I'd been unhappy in academics for a while. Large academic medical centers are just, whew, they're Byzantine. They move like a battleship powered by an outboard motor. You can't make changes in them. It's just, and especially in Wisconsin, I thought they were stuck like 20 years ago. But
It's a
I
bureaucracy.
kind of always had been wanting to leave, but COVID was the last straw. And so I resigned. But then the next job I lost was the day after my testimony on Ivermectin, because I didn't tell my hospital. I was working at a major center in Milwaukee at that point, and they were ripping because they had actually some rationale to be angry at me. So number one, I didn't tell them I was testifying, which is fine. I don't need to tell anyone. But when I gave that testimony on the chyron at the bottom of the screen, it actually said the center that I was working at. So they were like, and apparently the next day the phones were ringing off the hook at the hospital for people wanting to see Dr. Kory or get ivermectin. And they were getting rocked. This is in the height of like a huge surge. And so they called me in the morning, like the next day, and they said, do not speak to the press until we meet. It was the chief medical officer, my boss. And, they said that they were working on a new contract for me because they were canceling my old contract. And I told them right there in that meeting, Nathan, I said, if you put in any clause which infringes on my First Amendment rights, we don't have to have the meeting. Wow. And they were like, just wait, we'll meet tonight. Met them that night. During the meeting, they sent me my new contract. Like, they hadn't sent it to me beforehand. They sent it to me during the meeting. I'm reading it and I'm like, I already told you guys, if you put in these clauses, there's like 6 clauses that would have prevented me from talking to the press. And I said, I cannot accept this. And so I lost that job. And then my third job was a year later. I had been working as an independent contractor at an ICU at a hospital in middle Wisconsin. And I loved that job. I was making really good money. Nurses loved me. My colleagues in the critical care, on the critical care team loved me because I was teaching them a lot about COVID. Some of them had already had my book on ultrasound. And so they knew me. So they were like psyched that they got me like in central Wisconsin where they can't recruit anyone. And I was working there very happily. But here's the thing, Nathan, while I was working, my colleagues were telling me that the administration was sending them emails telling them to get rid of Kory. And they stood up for me. They said, if Kory goes, we go. And so they protected me for 6 months. And I don't know what happened, but right around the vaccine mandates coming down, the chief medical officer was calling me to find out if I was going to get vaccinated. And I said, let me think about it. The only thing I had to think about was whether I was going to get a fake card or just say no. And ultimately, I decided to get a fake card. And so when he called, he gave me 2 days to think about it, call me back. I was on a Friday and I said, okay, fine. I'll get vaccinated next week. You guys win. And that Friday, then I worked that weekend. Monday morning, I woke up to a phone call telling me that they no longer needed me. They were hoping to get rid of me through the mandate. And when I told them I was getting vaccinated, they fired me.
Yes. Wow. So, and it's not like you in the practice of trying to, use medications that we had great safety profiles on. You're trying to help patients early on in a time when we really didn't know what was going on. And I can't imagine what it was like being in those critical care units where you guys were just trying to solve problems when we really had no information. But you were implementing a strategy that had been used by medicine for decades. I mean, it's not like you guys were all of a sudden saying, oh, we're going to use these repurposed medications. And that whole concept it was foreign to everybody. And so not only were you not doing it alone, you were a leader. You were a leader of critical care specialists and you were leading units. And so I think that's what's so unique about you. And people go, he lost a job. He lost a second job. He lost a third job. You put your livelihood on the line to speak truth in the opposition of what almost seems to be everything everywhere you turned.
Yeah. Yeah. This, besides the stuff that happened to me personally, like I was just observing absurd scientific policies that were so devoid and divorced from the science, and also pragmatism, precautionary principles, common sense. I saw medical ethics being violated suddenly. And I used to sit on ethics committees throughout my career. I love medical ethics, and I like my work on ethics committees. There's always critical care docs on ethics committees because most of the tough ethical cases, come out of the ICU. And I had always held medical ethics, inviolable. And suddenly I saw it. It was like it didn't exist. It was like it was fake news, like it just disappeared overnight. And so, but I saw such bizarre things, like I'll tell you one of my awakenings was the beginnings of my awakening, because this was more of a head scratcher. But I remember being in my car. This is spring of 2020. And the radio announced that the FDA had restricted hydroxychloroquine to the hospital. And I remember being in my car like, what? I was like almost screaming at the radio because I'm like, that makes no sense. So first of all, I didn't know hydroxychloroquine worked. I was kind of I dismissed hydroxychloroquine. I didn't think it was that important. But one thing I did know is that if you're going to use something against the virus, you're going to use it within the first hours or days of that illness. Early treatment for a virus is critical. You would never use hydroxychloroquine in the hospital phase. And so, right there, I was like, something doesn't make sense here. What are they doing? And this is before hydroxychloroquine was, quote unquote, proven to not work, right? And so already there, I thought something was really off. And that just continued, and then the ivermectin. It's funny, I sound so kind of smart and all-knowing now, but when I think back, like I was trying to tell you, like after that testimony, like, again, I just kept scratching my head, being shocked at things that were happening. Whereas knowing what I know today, nothing would surprise me. Everything would be predictable. Everything they did was totally predictable because, again, from that disinformation playbook, corporations and industries have been practicing these tactics, these disinformation tactics, for decades. The tobacco industry invented the playbook. And they invented the playbook after Babe Ruth got cancer and died. He was like their biggest advertising spokesperson. He was smoking. He was Babe Ruth. Then he got jaw cancer. And then, amongst the population, people started to question the safety of cigarettes, that maybe it causes cancer. And that's when they started disinformation. They started publishing studies, right, which show that there is no link between cigarettes and cancer. And they did that kind of stuff for about 50 years, right, until that master settlement agreement by the entire nation's attorney generals that took down the tobacco industry in terms of having them pay billions, right, and then admit that their product was not safe. And so, but that took 50 years, right? They were successful for 50 years.
You talk about the tobacco industry, and there's a lot of correlates to, though, a lot of the, fascist and Marxist dictators of the 19th and 20th century. So it's not exactly the same, but there is, they were propagating a narrative.
100%.
It wasn't about truth. It wasn't about, unfactual information. It was simply saying, here's a narrative we're going to go with, and we are going to propagate it. And those that stand in the way, Dr. Pierre Kory, we're going to take them out. We're going to censor them. We are going to then propagate our own narrative about him and his lack of credibility, quote unquote. And that's the propaganda. So that's really what that was. And people think about that from a war perspective, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's not war. But that's actually what they've done here.
They've always done that to dissidents, right? They have, and in the disinformation playbook, right, it's 5 tactics. They're named after American football plays. It's the fake, the fix, the screen, the diversion, and the blitz. The blitz is harassing scientists who are producing, researchers who are producing that inconvenient science. And there was a famous article on NBC News from years ago. Merck kept a hit list of doctors who were talking bad about Vioxx, because doctors were figuring out that Vioxx was actually causing heart attacks and strokes. And they started to speak out about it, that they did not think it was a safe drug. And Merck was following and keeping lists of them. And so another great example of the blitz is, and it was made into a major motion picture, right? It's with the NFL when they blitzed Dr. Bennett Amalu, right? He discovered the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right? All those microhemorrhages that were showing up in the brains of retired football players who became psychotic, depressed, suicides. And when he started to write about that football was causing that devastating disease, they went after him, boy. And they started putting, they started publishing papers showing that, like, there's this one journal that some people called the Journal of No NFL Concussions, because it was a journal literally that they were feeding papers to that were claiming that there's no links between brain disease and football. And so, that is true. They go after those who speak, bring out the inconvenient science.
It really seems to me, we knew this was maybe a problem going into 2019. Really, we talk about, I talk about cancer being something that there's cancer post-pandemic and there's cancer pre-pandemic. But I think our perspective on medicine, I think, can be divided in that. And history is going to, I think, really create that division in that before we thought there was a push to just, create groupthink and protocol medicine. And granted, there's a place for protocols. But really what the pandemic, I think, brought forth is that, no critical thinking allowed, no independent thinking allowed, no questions allowed if it's counter to the narrative we want to propagate. So basically I think that was your greatest threat to them, is you were willing to question. Isn't that interesting? You were willing to question and then speak out about that.
Yeah. Yeah. That you just brought up, that. You're right. Before COVID, medicine was already moving towards kind of a rigid protocolization, stick to the guidelines, and this absurd, brazen corruption of evidence-based medicine, right? Which is supposed to be our leading and guiding field of study to direct how we treat patients. Evidence-based medicine has been stolen. And they've corrupted it. And they took the randomized controlled trial, right? The large randomized controlled trials, put it on top of a pyramid. And they're saying all other types of evidence and source of data and research is literally just not convincing, right? You have to have this large randomized controlled trial. Now, who can do large randomized controlled trials? Entities with a lot of money. So repurposed drugs don't get studied, right? And when they are found to be effective, they'll conduct trials to neutralize them, which is called the fake. And that's the most powerful weapon that they wielded in their war against ivermectin, their war against hydroxychloroquine, right? Nathan, I wrote the book, The War on Ivermectin, but one of my colleagues could have easily written the book, The War on Hydroxychloroquine, and they could just copy my book and just substitute hydroxychloroquine for ivermectin, because it was the same tactics and same results. They killed hydroxychloroquine in 2020, and then they killed ivermectin in 2021. And, what they do with these journals, I mean, the manipulations and fraud in these trials was so brazen, and they would sail to publication in the top journals in the world. New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association were publishing these horrific trials that were intended to have a predetermined result. They all had predetermined results. They were designed and conducted to show something didn't work, and you could see how they did it, how they were doing it, and that was the most. I would say that was the most. That was the thing that probably awoke me the most to just the endemic corruption in the biomedical sciences around anything that can produce a profit. And ivermectin threatened so much. It threatened the entire vaccine campaign. It threatened the markets for Paxlovid, Molnupiravir, Remdesivir. I mean, those markets would have been obliterated if ivermectin was recognized as effective. And so they had to destroy it.
You threatened their business model, Pierre. I mean, I actually, this quote is really interesting because it's a means to manipulate the public that reads it about what your objective was. They said, quote, he is an advocate for ivermectin. And I was like, okay, so basically they're just saying you're an advocate for a antiparasitic medication and its repurposed use as a virus. But honestly, what they completely did not tell there was that, no, what you were doing was an advocate for the truth. You were an advocate for patients. You were an advocate for empowerment of doctors to help patients. And they try to cover that by saying you're an advocate for ivermectin.
And it's very disrespectful, right? Because you could have easily written the world's leading expert on the clinical evidence for ivermectin and COVID. Like that would have been a fair description. I was buried studying. It's like, but no, I'm not an expert. I'm an advocate. Suddenly I'm an advocate. They don't want to mention, like I was about to become a full professor when I resigned from University of Wisconsin, and like none of my credentials, none of my career, suddenly I've turned into some sort of advocate for a discredited horse dewormer, and so that's, again, it attacks my credibility. So people don't listen to this fringe, right-wing, quack, anti-vaxxer. They throw everything at me in these articles. And it's sad. I'll give you a little anecdote that happened yesterday. I was seeing a patient, and actually a cancer patient, because I was treating them with my, repurposed drug protocol.
Yeah.
And they told me that I think it was their brother, who's a doctor, when the brother found out that the patient was seeing me, the brother said to my patient, that guy's a quack. He's not even board certified. Right? Because we can talk about that. That was another big censoring action.
Please do, because they tried to take away, they took away your jobs, but they tried to take away simply your access to practice medicine, not take away your job position at a hospital. They try to take away your access to practice medicine, Pierre.
And they were successful,
I about drove off the road. I think it was I heard you on TP Charlie Kirk's podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I about drove off the road when I heard you announcing, what you and Paul Merrick were going through. I about lost it.
Yeah, it really is. It's just it's evil. It's what it is. It's evil. And the first things that happened to me in terms of with regulatory authorities was, for your listeners, when we say I lost my board certifications, that's not a license to practice medicine, although it almost acts as that. What that is, it used to be, right, just a badge of distinction, right? When you were board certified, you could puff out your chest a little bit more because you had passed this higher level exam, and, you could introduce yourself as I'm board certified in this. And so it was like a title almost, but then they weaponized it, right? So now, in order to work in most hospitals and basically every academic medical center, you need to be board certified. To be on insurance plans, you need to be board certified. And so by taking away my board certifications, they effectively excommunicated me from the system of medicine, but luckily not from practicing medicine. Now, it really didn't have material impact on me because by the time they did that, I've already happily been in private practice. I'm fee-based. I don't take insurance. And so I'm still safe practicing medicine, but let's flip back to my state medical board. So my license was I have a few licenses, but one was in Wisconsin. And complaints started to come in against me for being a misinformationist. And they were coming in from anonymous physicians, pharmacists. I remember one line from one complaint which says that they should take my license because I bring disrepute to the physicians of Wisconsin. And I piled up 11 complaints. I rebutted each and every one of them, burying them with citations and data for everything that I had said. And I got no response for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. From the first complaint to their final decision, it was 2 years. And what happened with me in Wisconsin is very different than what happened to my colleagues around the country. So take people like Meryl Nass from Maine, right? She literally had her license suspended and was told to get neuropsychological testing because she was using ivermectin. Ryan Cole in Washington, they went after him, Michael Turner. Well, around the country, they've literally taken licenses away from physicians. And so I was worried about Wisconsin, but in the end, Nathan, they gave me a warning. And that warning is actually not even public. it's public that I've been warned, that I've received a warning, but the nature of the warning is not public. And so it was the lightest slap on the wrist in comparison with what was happening to other doctors who were speaking out or using ivermectin. And so I was, I got lucky. Now we can ask the questions: why was Wisconsin so gentle with me? I'd like to think it's because I got a loud mouth and I had an organization behind me that had a lot of media reach, and like they didn't want to mess with me, because one thing I noticed when I was with the FLCCC is anytime censoring action would come at us or the FLCC or something happened, that riled up our supporters like nothing else. I mean, they would literally, because they knew they had to protect us, the ones who were doing the right thing for the right reasons and who are not backing down, from this domination and like literally rigid protocols and telling you what you could do and what you couldn't do. They want us out there. And patient, Nathan, it goes without saying that we're talking today about what's happened to me, right? Yeah. And the things that I've had to go through. But who does that really hurt? It hurts me, but it's the patients. And because the problem with these censoring acts, especially the boards were devastating for a few reasons, right? Didn't materially impact me, but in terms of reputation. So I've done a lot of expert defense or even plaintiff work in malpractice cases over the years. In fact, I was one of the expert witnesses in George Floyd case. Wow. I can no longer be an expert witness. How are you ever going to sit in a stand, be deposed? The other lawyer is going to go nuts. Yeah, like you've had your board certifications revoked. And even that anecdote I just told you about this physician brother of my patient telling my patient that guy's a quack, he lost his boards, right? And so they succeeded with that, but I think the bigger impact of them taking my boards and Paul's boards is that it scares the other physicians from doing what I did. And that is so damaging to patients. Patients should be scared of what they're doing because you're no longer going to have a doctor giving you free, transparent, conflict of interest free advice. I would argue, Nathan, that every employed physician, every physician that works for a healthcare entity has a conflict of interest, not in terms of financial, in terms of keeping their employment. They cannot be open and honest and critical of some of these policies, because as soon as you do that, you lose your job. So it's almost like a negative financial conflict of interest, meaning they can't do the right thing because they'll lose their job. And now they know they could lose their boards.
It was really a public inquisition that they went after you and Paul and others. And in essence, what they did with, your board certification license, it really makes me wonder, when we look at the license, the board certifications, it's really just a piece of paper with, just a bunch of charades behind it. But, it was a public burning at the stake. That's really what it was, to try to intimidate and put the fear of God in other doctors and say, don't you dare do what they do because you will reap the same. So when people go, why do doctors not speak out?
They can't. They're going to lose their livelihood, Nathan. This is something I've said for a few years now, is that one of the things that I took away from this experience throughout the pandemic is that the desire to remain employed is so powerful, not just amongst the physicians, because Nathan, let's ask the question. When you ask, like, how many whistleblowers COVID was such a multifaceted fraud, which was, conducted by the holy trinity of the pharmaceutical industry, health agencies, our government, and the media, right? And how few whistleblowers, right? Especially in journalism, right? I don't know if you know who Ivory Hecker is, but she's this journalist who worked for Fox News in Texas. And she, in the middle of a live broadcast, just basically called out her bosses about this because she wanted to do a piece on ivermectin. And she basically quit on air, or basically got fired on air, because what she said was in a live broadcast. And she just called out Fox News for censoring. That's one journalist. Maybe there's a couple others who've left over this, but there's tens and 20,000 journalists in the country, probably 100,000 journalists. None of them have spoken out about the censorship. And then if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, right? You have, Brooke Jackson, right? She was a whistleblower in the trials. There's many other people who saw what she saw. Where are they? Where are they? And then in the agencies, the CDC, you remember when two high-level FDA officials resigned over the recommendations around the vaccine? I think when they were about to approve it for kids or something. Two of them resigned, but that's it. I mean, you can't. It's like two hands that can count the number of whistleblowers, right? Or people who really took public actions to call out the fraud.
What was that even really a whistleblower? That was just them ashamed. And it was a way to try to draw attention to it, but not in a public.
Yeah, you're right. Way. That was like that's like a half action, but
yeah.
But going back to my point, that desire to remain employed is so strong. That's why I'm saying that anyone employed now has a conflict of interest. They cannot speak openly and honestly and truthfully.
It's an advocacy to the system. It's an advocacy to their paycheck. It's an advocacy to the government bureaucracy. But the person that gets left out of that advocacy is the patient. And that's why I think you've been so powerful, Pierre, is because that has been the central theme of what you've done. It's been about the patient. Now, I think the truth obviously ties into that, and obviously empowerment of other physicians has, I think, come alongside that. But it's that truth and that adherence to what it means to be a doctor.
Yeah,
it's about the patient and what you've gone through. I don't know that I've ever heard the story quite like that. I knew bits and pieces of it, Pierre, but, most people, many strong people would probably have backed down a long time ago with what you've gone through. But you have not. How did you, and we'll start to close with this, but
sure.
I have a good friend that wrote a book. She was she was a school teacher, became a administrator, high administrator in a big insurance company, not health insurance, but she wrote a book called Bold: Believe It, Own It, Live It, Duplicate It. And that's really kind of what I think that acronym applies to you here.
I like that.
Shout out Deborah Boblet. So, but how did you focus on solutions? Was there a point where you said, I need to do something about this? I got to focus on solutions. Did you do it yourself? Did you reach out to others? Did you try to find colleagues? I mean, how did you handle that?
So, well, here's what I would say is it happened early on in the beginning. So when COVID was coming to our shores, and we knew it was coming, and cases started to pop up in Seattle and New York. Paul and I were running ICUs. I was the head of my ICU, University of Wisconsin. He was at Norfolk Centara in Virginia, and he was a good friend of mine. He and I bonded over vitamin C research some years prior, and we just started sending each other papers and, reading about it. And, we were going to the ICU every day. We're trying different things. We're trying to figure stuff out. And then someone approached Paul and told him to get some people together and form an organization, put out our protocols. And so I would just say, I was a pulmonary and critical care specialist as the world was getting enveloped with a pulmonary and critical care disease. Mm-hmm. And I was like, game on, and I just went at it. And then the FLCC was born. I co-founded that with Paul, and then that gave us a lot of prominence. So by that time, as things were going on, I had a network around me. I had support. We actually did really well in terms of donations. We were able to hire a lot of people. We had PR people. And so we were a force in ourselves. And I would say the money that came in to help us was hugely important, because what is it that we fought? We fought a war of information, right? I mean, we had to fight against all of the censorship and propaganda. And the thing that saved us is the internet. And independent media like yourself, is without the internet, we would have been toast. You would have just been hearing from, the talking heads on television telling you the supposed truths of the day. Whereas at least with the internet, you could find out that there was information out there that they weren't telling you and that they were lying about. And so we were putting out all this information, and I just had a lot of support, not only from donors, from my colleagues, people I met. And, suddenly I entered this, let's call it a medical freedom movement, especially like around the vaccines. And then I started to meet people and organizations that have been fighting this war a lot longer than I have, right? People like Del Bigtree with ICANN, Informed Consent Action. I started to get very close with Children's Health Defense, right? They've been fighting this longer than I have. And so
long time.
There's this very mature movement. And then there's like all these organizations of like, tiger moms of children who've been badly injured, severely autistic from vaccines. And they've been awake for 20, 30 years. And so I entered a community, and I got to say I was very warmly embraced. I think Children's Health Defense loved me because I was, a highly credentialed, successful academic physician who'd been part of the system. And I figured out like, there's a lot that's rotten in Denmark. And, I came out and I spoke boldly and loudly. And I think I added my voice to a movement that I'm still a part of today, and I think always will be.
Yeah. And you're one of the leaders of the movement. And again, what I admire about what you've done is it's working to restore the hierarchy of what we as physicians do. And the word physician, it's a Hebrew word. It can mean healer. The word doctor in Latin can mean teacher. And I think that ties into a lot of what you've discussed here is everything you were doing was trying to teach the public, teach the patients, teach the bureaucracy, teach doctors to heal patients. I mean, it was the essence of what it means to be a physician and doctor that drove you to do what you do. And now you're basically just continuing that leadership as you move forward. So, I mean, what does Dr. Pierre Kory do next? I mean, what are you up to and where are you going?
Well, to your point, when doctor, right, the Latin word is for teacher. And, what was natural for me for all of this and what's going to continue to be is that I was always an educator. I love teaching. I used to be the director of a training program for pulmonary and critical care doctors. I've won teaching awards at all the major institutions I've worked at, and like residents and fellows and students love me. And now that I've left, now the public is my classroom. So I have a much larger classroom, and people are so appreciative. And so going forward, my next chapter, I'm still continuing my private practice, which is focused on the care of the vaccine injured and long COVID, and immensely complex. I enjoy doing that. I'm continuing to write, and then I'm starting a new nonprofit, which is called Rebuild Medicine. And we're one of our first missions is to focus on increasing research and affecting policy around repurposed drugs, something that I know is near and dear to your heart, Nathan.
Yeah.
But that's what we want to do. And we know repurposed drugs is the Achilles heel of that pharmaceutical industry. That is a big bear. That is the one thing that they try to destroy is repurposed drugs because they're off patent and they decimate profits. So they always want you to take the shiny new pill, forget about the old pills that are off patent. That.
Yeah. So where can people find your book? Where can people find your writings?
Yeah, awesome. So the book, The War on Ivermectin, that's on Amazon. My Substack is pierrekorymedicalmusings.com.
Yeah, you have just a few followers there, just a few.
Yeah, no, that's another thing. I love that. I mean, I have a huge amount of subscribers. I'm just about to crack 100,000. And so when I write something, it's very, it's almost intimidating to think about that your voice is going out to so many people. I'm very careful what I write. I make sure everything's highly referenced. It's credible. I wouldn't put any crap out there, but, I enjoy writing on that. But and then my new nonprofit is called Rebuild Medicine. Do
you have a URL there yet?
Yes, and it's I believe it's Rebuild Medicine. I have to check.
Okay.
But yeah, and I think we're going to be more active as the new year comes. But
great.
always work to do.
Nathan, always. And so because we'll check out check out the show notes below because we're going to have as many references as I could find related to Dr. Pierre Kory's writings. Of course, you can find his book on Amazon. You can find his Substack. We'll put a link there. We'll put a link to the URL to his new nonprofit. And so Dr. Pierre Kory, always colleague, friend. We've gotten to know each other through the FLCCC, Ivermectin, et cetera. So great bringing you on again. Thank you for being honest and sharing your story. I know a lot of people are afraid to share and be vulnerable through that process. But then I think also to speak out about who came after you? And that's something that I think really provides the truth, and I think opens that curtain, if you will, where the Oz is standing behind. Yep. And what you actually see is not what you thought it was. But I think you're the force vector of change. And so I'm very optimistic about where medicine is going. And I think we can restore it to its original purpose because of leaders and advocates, that word, but you get it, like you, because you're changing, you're empowering patients and you're changing the direction. So thank you for what you do. And I look forward to staying in communication with you.
Nathan, it's a pleasure and an honor. Good to see you again. And thanks for talking. And I appreciate your work. And I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, that's right. Just keep going. Thank you for joining the Prescribe by Dr. Nathan Goodyear. You can check us out over at pre-scribe.com. This is a series that is just about censorship. So we're going to have more coming your way, and we have other series, kind of like channels, if you will. Check out the captions below for the supporting evidence, the show notes here. Please subscribe, and I encourage you to share this with others that you think would benefit from this. And I can tell you, everybody can benefit from Dr. Pierre Kory's story because it has been reproduced time and time again. He sacrificed, he persevered to actually work to preserve the doctor-patient relationship. He's a modern day hero. He is, and he just happens to be a colleague and I consider a friend. So again, Pierre, thanks again. Please share, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next Prescribe by Dr. Nathan Goodyear.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribe Podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribe.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribe. We'll see you for your next refill.